Welcome to Nature Knows, Conversations with Wild Warriors and Changemakers. I'm your host, Jen Vitanzo, and this podcast is all about nature, both the wild kind outside our front doors and the human kind written within our DNA. Each episode showcases an individual who has dedicated their efforts to create a better today to ensure we have an actual tomorrow. And they are using their unique creative fingerprints to do it. From PhD students to Grammy winners, community organizers to outdoor educators, engineers to multimedia artists, these are the wild warriors and changemakers constructing the bridges necessary to connect us all, human to human, species to species, worlds to worlds. It's in our nature to want a sense of purpose. If you haven't already found it, maybe this crew of amazing individuals will inspire you to find yours. Hi, and welcome to Nature Knows, Conversations with Wild Warriors and Changemakers. I am your host, Jen, and this is our first episode. Our guest today is a woman named Sarah Johnson, and she is the founder of Wild Rose Education. I chose her to be the first guest because in order to understand the world, you have to learn about it, and it all starts with education. So, without further ado, I will let Sarah tell you her story. Thanks so much for tuning in. I hope you enjoy it. Hi.
Hello, how are you?
I'm good. How are you doing?
I'm pretty well. It's been a crazy reality, but other than that, things I have a lot to be grateful for. So,
give us a quick brief intro of who you are and what you do and all that fun stuff.
Yeah, so I am in Western Colorado in Carbondale, where Wild Rose Education is based, and we're up in the mountains at 6,000 feet. And I originally, though, am from Southwest Missouri, very rural community, literally out in the middle of nowhere. So, but I've been here in Colorado since 2004. So it's become my home.
Yeah. What's the saying? I think it's once you've been somewhere 7 years, it's officially become like you become a native.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I was born in Colorado, so I can pull that card.
You were you technically are officially from Colorado. Okay.
Even though but I grew up in Missouri. I mean, that's a side note.
Can you kind of give us a little bit more background about Wild Rose Education, like where it came from in terms of the genesis of it, and then what you're doing with it?
Yeah, so Wild Rose Education came about in 2015 as I had worked in the environmental education field for many years and had worked with nonprofits and national parks and wilderness trip programs and lots of other kind of things in between. But in 2015, I was to the point of kind of outgrowing my position, and it was time to spread my wings and see what was possible and not necessarily know what was going to happen. And I was also halfway through grad school, so I was busy, and but then I quickly, or not, and so then I started getting some contract work that was mostly around in the water and watershed science and river science and water and public lands conservation realm. And those projects, some of them were one-off projects, and some of them I started to realize that they were going to repeat year after year if I wanted them to. And so I just kind of got on the bandwagon and just went for it and just said, okay, this is what's going to happen. And it actually did not start as Wild Rose Education. I was just Sarah Johnson LLC. And it wasn't till about a year later that I realized that there was an opportunity to actually create a business name and be a little more formal about things and be able to put my logo on publications and things. So Wild Rose Education came about in, I guess, 2016, because things were moving forward in such a good direction. And today, Wild Rose Education has become where it is today. I feel like it's always evolving and always being responsive to the world that we live in. And it's super flexible. In some ways that's exciting. In other ways that's a little unknowing. But Wild Rose Education today is an innovative environmental education, small woman-owned business. The focus is on professional development for educators, youth leadership development, as well as other environmental education contracting and independent consulting kinds of one-off projects. But those teacher professional development workshops and graduate classes and the Youth Water Leadership Program are really the big buckets of work and excitement and possibility that have been happening now. Some of those programs have been happening for 4 years now and just keep repeating, and I'm really proud of that.
That's awesome. And your excuse me, youth development, leadership development, what are the ages, or where does it start? Like, what's the youngest? And
Yeah, so how the program is designed is that the primary audience is high school youth, teenagers. However, there's always, because I make the rules, and if there's interesting people who have really strong interests and passions, we can always flex the rules as it may fit within the somewhat of the guardrails of the program. And so there at times are 7th and 8th graders involved, and at other times there's undergraduate students from the local community college have been involved, as well as some other university students from further afield. And so but the target group is really like 14, 15, 16-year-olds. And this year, because it's going virtual, we're able to expand the geographic reach to include the entire upper Colorado River Basin, which is basically western Colorado, eastern Utah, northeast Arizona, and southwest Wyoming. And so it's a very rural part of the United States, but it's the upper Colorado River Basin. So it's where all the water comes from for the Colorado River primarily. And so to be able to expand to that reach from the Navajo Reservation to Rocky Mountain National Park, down to Lake Powell, I just feel like is a kind of an unprecedented possibility. So we'll see what happens.
That's amazing. That's a big swath of land. And
Yeah,
there's so much within that too. So you can reach so many different communities that might not necessarily, I mean, I know that if you're in a city, it might not seem like there's a lot of nature or environmental stuff going on, but there definitely is, because there's a lot of organizations that are based in cities. And whether you're just doing sort of citizen science in your backyard and it just happens to be a park in the middle of a city, or, you're more of the suburbs, it just seems like there's more geared towards, because it's more centralized. And there's so many outlying areas that just don't get they don't get that opportunity. And something like that seems like such a brilliant way to reach so many more people and give that opportunity and expose more people to the stuff that's out there and how amazing it is. That's
Yeah,
really cool.
and I also think that we may live in a more or less densely populated region of the country. However, the Western United States is more people live in towns than live out in rural, in rural countryside, compared to, say, New York, where more people may live out there's people live out in the country, but we don't have as many people living out in the deserts because it's really difficult to live there. And so people are more centralized in small towns, which is just an interesting thing to think about. And the other thing is that people of all ages, I think, have a different relationship to the landscape when you live in such a wide open landscape or in a mountainous region, or where it's kind of it's in your face all the time to see the mountain or see the river or see the desert or see the whatever the landscape is, the plateau, wherever you may be. I think there's a different relationship than with the landscape than those who live in suburbia. And it's not to say one's more valuable than the other. They're both valuable in different ways. And but I think especially around the agricultural community, the people in agriculture have such a strong relationship with the landscape, probably more so than anybody else, because they have to survive. And to know the seasons and how things grow, and kids growing up on ranches and in fields growing melons and all the things we grow in this part of the country. And I think that in the upper Colorado River Basin, we do have a bit of quite the diversity of landscape and people. And so it's just an exciting time to see what will happen. But I'm also seeing it as a grand experiment because we've never done it before.
Yeah. It's interesting that you say that, because I've kind of found that living on game reserves and living with families that were on the game reserves, because you're so remote, but you are so very tied to the land around you. And so much more in tune with the land around you because you have no, you have to be. Whereas I find that with suburbia, and having lived in city, suburbia, and middle of nowhere, um, and farmland too, there is definitely a different relationship. And I find that in some cases with city and suburbia, you can block it out more because you don't have to be so closely connected to. We as a species have a habit of missing certain things. We're losing that connection,
Yeah.
which is such a shame because there really is such amazing stuff going on out there. Even in your, you're looking at just a plain tree, any tree that you can see with, it's like all this amazing ecosystem with so much just going on within that. And, having conversations with people as to like, well, I don't like rats because they're ugly or they're spreading diseases and they're doing this, or I don't like vultures because they're ugly or I don't, and I'm thinking, okay, but they're doing all these amazing things as well. I mean, they're cleaning up the refuse that we're leaving behind. They're preventing, in some ways, they're like vultures are preventing the spread of disease because they're cleaning up like their nature's undertakers.
Yeah.
So there's so much out there that we've sort of just kind of put on blinders to because we can. And
Yeah.
and I find like being in an area like that where you have it at your disposal constantly and it is integral to your life, your daily life, you have a very different relationship to it and an understanding. And it was always fascinating to me to be around people on game reserves who, you'd have guests that would come in and they would hate hyenas. They're like, oh, they're so ugly. But you'd have people in the reserve who like, they're one of our favorite animals because they do such good, they get rid of bones. It's pretty fascinating.
I think I just find myself regularly saying this, and I said it yesterday as I drug out all my funny pairs of glasses. And I was telling these teachers, I said, as a science educator or geography educator, whatever you may think I am, environmental educator, really my job in life is really teaching people how to see and how to have a relationship with what they see.
Yeah.
And I think, and so I have this silly activity where I have this whole bag of funny sunglasses or funny glasses. They're not sunglasses. And just to make the point that not only how to see, but that the way you see matters and that your perspective is critical to the community, however you define that word community, and that your perspective is not only important, it's necessary for the forward trajectory of a community to come together and move forward on whatever it may be. But it's how you see the natural world. It's how you see your neighbor. It's how you understand the purpose of a wetland as a big water filter, like you just described. There's the natural world has all these jobs, but if you never have been taught how to see and how to be an observer and how to ask questions and how to realize that your questions matter and what you are noticing is interesting and is worth sharing and is worth being part of a broader discussion. And you can do that through a lens of agriculture. You can do that through a lens of a city park. You can do that through the lens of a river or a wetland. And I've been fortunate to spend most of my career using rivers and public lands, and then the concepts of climate change and watersheds as the context for which I teach mostly through.
Mm-hmm.
But really, you can teach people how to see using any context that's of interest or is really a part of the world, the landscape, wherever you may be.
Well, it's fascinating you should say that because that's really so much of what I want to get across with a lot of these conversations is the fact that each of us have this unique voice, that each of us has something to contribute, and it's specific to us as who we are as humans. So we're all going to see different things because that's just how we're built. That's sort of in our DNA, and that each of us has something really valuable to contribute. And it's always been interesting when people have asked me particularly how I went from being an artist as a musician to working in conservation in South Africa. I'm like, well, they boil down to the same thing. It's that curiosity about understanding how the world works and sitting back and observing and interpreting and then taking that interpretation and creating something from it. And so I, like, in the same way that I would be an artist writing a song where I was, okay, I want to understand this, like this human emotion or this moment, or, and then I sit down and interpret it, create something from it. And then that's my output. It's like with a scientist researching something, it's like, okay, I want to understand why this species makes this particular call at this time, or only during the season, or whatever. And so, you sit there, you find your subject matter, you study it, you interpret what you're seeing, you work it against what's already in the scientific narrative, and then you put out your findings.
What I was just thinking about is as you were saying that, it's being kind of radically curious, or so that you can have this like never ending curiosity of one thing leading to the next. And I think in science education, we've been taught traditionally that the scientific method is this very linear thing. You have to have a question and then a hypothesis, and then you do this and you collect, you do your test and you make observation, and then you have results and it's done. And it's like, well, how boring is that? That's not really how the world really works. And if we look at the more recent research and understanding of science education, we realize we are encouraged to teach that science is a process, and that it goes kind of in circles, because one thing goes, you ask a question and then you start to investigate, and then you realize that you need to ask somebody and you need to find out what they already know about it, or you need to do sideline research, and then that leads you back to the question, and then all of a sudden you're moving a few more steps forward, and then you get sidetracked because there's something else that's curious and interesting, and it's this very much more of a system than it is this linear path. And I think that's applies to so many things. That's not just science. That's not just science. That's just
right.
How life works. And to be able to give voice to that and realize that that's okay, or that's actually an exciting way to see the world, and to be able to be open to all those possibilities, I think makes for a really rich life, as well as if we can teach that process and that way of being to young people, like we're setting them up for incredible success, I would imagine, I would hope.
Right.
And so again, just but you have to have some context, whether it's music or wildlife or
Something
rivers.
to connect to.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's really fascinating. I love the fact that you're doing environmental education education in general, but also using the whole idea of being able to see.
Yeah, you should see my bucket of glasses. They're pretty silly.
I love it. But it's so true. It's so fundamental to it, because if you change one little thing, suddenly you're even if you change your setting, or the literal glasses that you have on, it will change the colors that you're seeing now, and the shadows that you're seeing now. And it's the same way as someone who's painting a painting has to look at something, not from the perspective of what's my subject matter, but how does the light fall on it? And what is the expression, and what's the best medium to use, and how can I best capture what it is that I'm trying to convey? And it's the same, like science, very much. They're all very, whether you're talking about like medicine, whether you're talking about finance, they all kind of fall into the same category, which is, what is it that I'm trying to achieve? I have to look at it from a lot of different perspectives. I kind of have to get to the root of it, and use what I have, and then keep adding more skills to be able to broaden what I'm putting out there in the world, and broaden my perspective, and broaden my ability to output more stuff. And whether it's just theories on stuff or actual product, or, it's all interrelated. Mm-hmm. So, obviously your work is, I think your work is important. I think everyone should think your work is important.
I believe my work is important. I believe my work is important. I think that's what keeps me motivated to be so driven and tenacious to keep after it. Because I will say that being an independent business, doing this kind of work is at times can be quite challenging, and other times it's like this wide open world of possibility. So I continue to stay motivated. So I guess that means I believe it's important, and it's not just important, but there's evidence that I hear back from learners, whether they're adults or adult learners or teenager students. Their feedback in different ways is really reassuring and extremely hopeful. To kind of create these opportunities for transformational learning makes me feel like my work will last a lot longer than just that maybe hour or 5-hour interaction I may get with a person. Right. And I don't want them to necessarily remember me, but I want them to remember what they've learned and what they're learning as they continue to wrestle with this new way of kind of seeing the world, or a new way of thinking about concept. And as they continue to work with it and mold it over and continue to ask questions, and I'm like, wow, that's success. Maybe they even have dinner table conversations later with their friends or their families about whatever the concept is.
And it's a new way for them to connect with themselves too, like to see
Yeah.
themselves in a new way, which is
I want
amazing.
teachers to know that they are part of the scientific community. They're not just the high school science teacher. No. They are part of the many spokes of the wheel of the science community. You can have researchers and lab people and all these different people, but educators are incredibly important. And I think a lot of times teachers don't value them. They don't get told very often that they're professionals, and they
Right.
don't get told that they matter. And I think most people in general don't get told that they matter very much, and so that's all woven into all my work as well.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
guess
You
I just
definitely have.
care about people. I care about my community.
It seems like there's definite push, which I think is fantastic, sort of the positivity and saying that you have a voice and it's worth it, people should be, it's worth getting out there and you are worthy and you have so much to contribute. And I do feel like you totally to me in the right space, which is kids are so often told to just be seen and not heard and to sort of fit into these little roles and these are the rules and this is and I understand that rules have a place, it's like a time and a place, but as as a human being, like one of our main things is our curiosity. One of the main selling points of being a human is this insatiable curiosity and wonder about the world. And I feel like kids kind of sometimes they get a beat out of them. You're not allowed, you have to follow these rules. And I feel like teachers also get stuck being confined to that. And I
Yeah.
imagine like as an educator in your position, because you get to be more of you're an entrepreneur, but you're not bound as much by those rules. So you
No.
can work in those little niches and develop things that in other situations wouldn't be as easy to maneuver around. And that's fantastic because you're filling such an important gap that's necessary for development. It's necessary for people finding that connection to themselves, to their communities, to the world around them.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's
It's an exciting, it's a pretty unique space to be able to work because I don't have the bureaucratic boards and administrations that say, that you have to get everything approved by first. I can, decide to make a decision today, or I can sleep on it and then make the decision tomorrow, but I can make the decision. And I, a lot of times will confide in colleagues or friends or other mentors and folks before I make a big decision. But sometimes I'll just be like, you know what? It sounds to me like there's a big need for, like, this summer, there's a need for teenagers to have some connection with each other. They are, as we've lived through this pandemic, there's a lot of people, everybody needs more connection. And so without much thought, probably took me 2 or 3 days, I just decided, I was like, you know what, I'm going to offer a weekly teenager Tuesday afternoon watershed class club thing, and just put it out there and see if anybody's interested. And it has unfortunately turned out that not that many people were interested, but or unable to. I mean, there are a lot of things that kept it from happening. We really still can't get together in person in our community here, and so that, I think, is the biggest barrier. So, but I was hoping that by the time it was going to happen, it was going to happen. But the point of that is I saw there's a need, and I was like, let's just go on a whim, and I mean, I know how to do this. Let's see what happens. Or more specifically, a more successful version of the story is that the workshops, the graduate classes that I teach this summer, some of them have had so much interest, which I was super surprised by. I just decided, I was like, you know what, let's offer another section. Let's just put another class on the calendar for August. And that class is already 2/3 full. And, and I'm kind of like, wow, well, there's obviously an opportunity here. And I just went for it. So, but it is an interesting space to be in because you have to listen for those gaps, and you have to be really bold and a bit brave and courageous, and have a sense of, I guess, a sense of knowing that when I guess some days I feel this way more than others, but when I'm on my best A game, I feel like, the work I'm doing is important and it's valuable and it will contribute to other people's lives and to the natural world's protection. And I just need to keep doing it.
yeah.
But some days I don't feel so confident.
I think that's got to be the hardest thing about being an entrepreneur because there is no set path. You don't have a set salary, so to speak. You're not following any particular, you're not climbing any ladder. You're not, there's no, there's no guidebook, you know? And so as much as like your wins are amazing, when your failures are a little bit earth shattering because you're the one who's suffering the blow. It's like personally, it's you. It's not like a company can absorb it for you. It's not a, it's yeah. And I imagine like if you were to talk to a kid about your job that you're doing,
Yeah.
I would imagine you would describe, I mean, it's obviously there's the environmental education, which is, but you're really an entrepreneur. Like
Yeah.
you're like the do it yours, like do everything. Cause I mean, the stuff that you're doing, you have to be able to, if you're leading kids out into the wilderness, you also have to be responsible for their first aid. You have to be responsible for, so it's not just
And then
I
you have
can
to be
teach
able
you
to do all the graphic design to be able to
yes,
sell the program.
yes,
So like it goes across, it's everything from liability and first aid. Yeah. From wilderness medicine to graphic design, as
right.
well as, teaching the actual curriculum and making it really engaging. So if I was to tell a kid about what I do, I think what I would tell them is I'm not like a 13-year-old kid, like a middle schooler. I'd probably tell them that I'm a teacher because I am an educator, and but I'm not their traditional classroom teacher. I'm the kind of teacher who gets to explore topics and ideas that young people are interested in. And I do a lot of river and water science and river and water geography work. And that I get to help students like themselves learn how to investigate things that they're concerned about. And then I get to help them learn how to come up with some suggestions or solutions. And finally, I get to help young people learn how to talk to elected officials and decision makers and be able to share their solutions and concerns with those policymakers and be able to feel confident that they can be public speakers and communicators, so they really can feel like they are part of can participate in the community, whether it's at the town level or the state level or even the federal level. And I think that most middle school kids would be able to understand that, because
Right.
they would start to listen. I think they would be very curious because they're very, I think most middle school and high school students are tuned in to what's going on in the world, and they want to figure out how to talk to policymakers
Yeah.
about the things they care about.
You're literally
Um,
giving them a megaphone for how to change the world. Like you're giving them,
Absolutely. Yeah.
that's
And then
cool.
I would probably tell kids that I get to help their teachers, get to teach their teachers how to take field trips make field trips more fun and engaging. And I would what else do I tell them? I um, yeah, I work with their teachers a lot. I also get to work at the colleges and universities and teach classes to students there. And so I think that's a pretty more, it's hard for me to explain what I do exactly, but that's a good question because it makes me think about it in a 14, 13-year-old's perspective.
I gotta tell you,
Simplifies
I would
it.
wrap it up in that you help them change the world. Like
Yeah, yeah.
you're you're like the
But those are,
behind the scenes,
but
the
those are,
behind the scenes genius helping them change the world.
yeah. But those are I think some tangible concepts that
Yeah. Oh,
they could
absolutely.
wrap their head around.
Right. Right. That's really cool. So in terms of your skills and your experiences and things that you're interested in, for someone else to be involved in what you do, what would you say has been or have been like, is there one or are there several specific things that you think have really come in handy in terms of your skills, your interests, and your experiences to help you
Yeah.
continue on, like get to where you are and continue on? Because you started with an interest in nature anyway, right?
Yeah, I was doing this kind of, I guess you could call it work. I mean, as like a kid, I was going to camp, and then I was designing the camp nature program when I was in high school, and I ended up getting my Girl Scout Gold Award by doing that. And that
That's so
was
cool.
20 years ago. And so yeah, so this people ask for like if there was ever this pivotal moment, and I don't ever have a very good answer for that question because I was just born into it. But I think as far as what makes me successful and what I caution people against, I think it's so important to work in some type of business or nonprofit that's small enough that you get an opportunity to learn everything. You learn how to use databases, you learn how to do graphic design, you learn how to market a program, you learn about budgets, you learn about fundraising, you learn about how to work with people and how to make phone calls and how to engage with people in so many different ways. And and you also learn the content, whether you're working around rivers or wildlife or whatever the content is, that is the part that you can learn and you probably already are an expert at. It's all these other skills that I don't know how to learn, I would have ever learned them if I hadn't had those 8 years working for a really small conservation nonprofit where I had to learn everything, everything. And some days I was getting to do field river chemistry work. And a lot of days I was in the office learning about how to keep track of donors and how to keep track of how to run a website. And then other days I'd be out leading a naturalist float where we would go floating down the river in inflatable duckies, inflatable kayaks. And that was the sexy work. That was fun. That was like why I was okay to do all that other stuff, because we finally got to do the thing. But doing of the thing, I think you spend about probably 60 to 70% of the time doing the behind the scenes work. And you really only 20 or 30% of your time is that front, that outward work that everybody might see.
Yeah.
And I get to talk with grad students a fair amount who are like in their early to mid 20s, sometimes later 20s. And they're convinced that they're going to go to grad school and then they're going to start their own business as an environmental educator. And I pause and I take a deep breath and I think their passion and their interest is commendable. And I just don't see very many people doing work in this field the way that I'm doing it. And I think that's because it's so difficult. And because if you don't have had some big world to kind of lean on or learn from previously with all the skills I was just describing, I don't know how you can do it. And I think that's why there's so few people. And so I caution people against this big dream of grad school and then starting their own environmental ed business. And it's amazing how many people kind of have that vision, which again is extremely awesome for the world. I just want them to be successful.
Right. It's almost like, don't burn yourself out right off the bat, because you're missing the skills that you would need to make yourself successful. And I'm sure you can learn them as you go, but you're going to have to deal with a whole very steep learning curve that's going to take away potentially, and it'll probably burn you out because you're going to be overwhelmed. I know I went through that myself with stuff. I was like, I'm just going to do this. And then I was like, I don't know what I'm doing. And then I had to learn everything all at one time. And I was like, this is
insane.
I don't have enough hours. There's not enough hours in the world ever. Yeah. So, I think that's really interesting, because I know I've talked to people sort of the same thing in different fields that have been like, I'm just going to jump right into it. And I'm like, I applaud that. Absolutely. I applaud that belief that you just go out in there and do it. And by all means, don't ever lose that. But I'm of the same mindset of you, which is take some time. It's going to sound terrible, but take some time to make some mistakes on someone else's dime, so to speak.
Where you have where you have a net to catch you.
You have a net to catch you, and you can learn from people that are already doing it, which takes away some of the work that you have to do. You can have a foundation that you can build, that people can help you develop, so that you have a jumping off point that's already solid.
Right.
Yeah.
And I would just add to that, not only all of that is really important, but also during those 8 years, as well as the previous things I did, is the incredible amount of professional networking. And I'm not just talking about, the local coffee meetups right here in our little town. Right. I'm talking about the statewide and the national professional organizations that I've been fortunate to be part of, and not only just going to their conferences, but actually serving in leadership, as well as volunteering to present and contribute at conferences and teach workshops, and not not get paid to do it. You do it because you're contributing to this greater good of this professional community. And what I have received from those by giving so much, the receiving is tenfold more valuable. If I hadn't done, or if I had not invested in that part of my life and my professional life before 2015, I would not be able to, Wild Rose Education would not exist. It was 3 weeks after I told the world I was leaving my organization that people literally started calling me. They're like, and they'd heard through these networks that I was needed, I was available. And folks from Denver called me and said, we've heard that you might need some work. Would you like to run this program? And I was like, as a matter of fact, thank you very much. That's amazing. I can't believe I just got this phone call. And that's how all of my work has happened. There are not RFPs for this work.
Yeah.
I'm not responding to posted, calls for proposals anywhere. Those don't exist.
Right.
At least I don't know where to look for them. So that network and that community and those people have become, over the last 10 years, 15 years now, are like some of the coolest people I know. And I've been grieving the fact that I see them on these Zoom calls right now, and we're all supposed to have been at conferences and meetings, and we're supposed to be together in all these places. And I'm like, I'm grieving the feeling of like, oh, I guess it's wonderful to see you now, but I don't know when we'll get to see each other. Maybe in 2021 or 2022. But it's to have that kind of relationship where it's like, it's sad. It's like, I care about them. Those relationships have grown into such genuine, authentic things. They're not just these rubbing elbows, networking things. It's like we're real humans, authentic people with each other, and have become friends.
And you call on each other with stuff that you're working on and can talk to each other about.
Yeah. So I'm not on, I don't work by myself, even though it appears that way. I'm on so many teams, and I get to integrate so many other people's incredible expertise. And it appears that I work by myself, but I don't. I am so fortunate to be part of so many different things with such amazing humans.
That's the whole no one is an island, right? It's like, it may seem like you're doing it all yourself. And you with your business, to a degree, yes, you are. And you're also like relying on other people that are helping you, and you're helping each other. And it is that sense of community. It is that, you help them, they help you. It's all about building each other up for bigger things, bigger and better things.
Yeah. And then sometimes you get to celebrate those people and like nominate them for like professional awards. And then they get selected, and then you get to call them. This just happened last week. And you get to call them and say, guess what? I nominated you for an award, and you've been selected by this statewide organization. And how cool is that?
Awesome. That's such a good feeling. It's
like,
I've never understood people that don't celebrate successes of friends and coworkers. And I guess some people just don't, they feel like, well, maybe it should have been me or whatever. And I'm thinking, you are you, and there's only one you, and you have your space, and you'll find it. And it's like, it isn't a competition in my mind. It's always been about, everybody's got something incredibly valuable to contribute, and celebrate that. And like,
and it's all so unique. Thank goodness it is, because otherwise we'd be really boring.
Right.
What you value and what I value are a little different, but thank goodness they are, because then we have something to talk about,
It's like a standing joke with some of the researchers I worked with. And one works with pangolin. One works with sociable weavers and pygmy falcons. And then someone else works with, I think it was a hyena person. And they love them each. And they're all extremely important, obviously, for the diversity of the ecosystem and the functioning of the ecosystem. But this person just loves that animal. And that's something that's like, they're super passionate about. And if we all just love that one animal, all the other ones would probably fall by the wayside, and everything would just, go horribly wrong. Because
that's why, and I think that's why I've been really appreciating, as much as I've been challenged by and has been like mentally stumped, like, okay, now where do I go with this work, with the really big emphasis and incorporation and prioritization of diversity, equity, inclusion work it's not like something that it's now time to go do diversity, equity, inclusion work. No, it's how to turn that into a lens that you do everything through.
Right.
And that is a big challenge, but it's in the last 5 or 6 years, it's just been it's made things even richer. And when you think about, like, I've been teaching these public lands classes and thinking about Native Americans and the trauma in American history is full of trauma, but we don't really talk about it much. And to have to talk about it, to bring it to the table, and to then listen to all these different students' perspectives, as well as all these we read all these stories and get exposure to all these kind of unsung heroes and untold stories. And it's just like, oh my gosh, what a more colorful, rich, abundant story of where we are, what it means to be an American. But it's added to my world. It's added to my perception, as opposed to been like a burden or like, oh gosh, well, you have to do. No, not at all. Instead, it's like everybody's perspective and all these stories. And I mean, you can only absorb so much. I mean, you can't learn it all, but you can start to be aware of more. And I mean, I'm not crazy about having lots of stuff, but I love having lots of stories.
Right.
and lots of perspectives. Yeah.
And that's what's so fascinating, is that we've had such a white-centric everything in so many fields, especially like you don't get to see a lot of representation of different faces, and that's starting to change. I think it's inspirational for kids growing up to say, oh wait, I can see myself in this. It's not just all these people that don't look like me or don't come from the same background, because it tends to become exclusionary. It feels exclusionary to say, oh well, I can't do that because nobody I know, like nobody does that. And
yeah.
But it's also all these rich, like you're saying, the cultures, it's different perspectives. It's different cultures that are going at something from a different, like a Native American culture might be very differently approaching one thing versus someone with a European culture, the cultural background. It's just different. It's just different. And it adds to this complexity and beautiful, like just
beauty. Yeah. That's the word. It makes it more beautiful.
Yes.
And I think if it's just the context and the lens that we use for everything, and it's just the way we operate, I think we have an opportunity to really model for not just our students, but for our peers and our families and everybody we come in contact, to just kind of be like, oh, that's just how Sarah is, and that's how she sees things. And I really appreciate this or that, and I want to be more like that.
Right.
And if like everybody, or a huge percentage of people start, even a small percentage of people start just being that way the best they can, I think there's again an opportunity for a lot of hope right there. And by no means I don't have it. Like I said, it's a challenge. I have to give myself permission to make mistakes in that arena, and give myself a lot of grace to say I'm sorry, and because it's a world that it's not the world that we were necessarily taught when we were little kids.
We're learning. We're all learning.
We're all learning. We were all taught that to be nice and kind, but it's like taking that to another level. And I just
really taught in a certain lens that we weren't even aware existed.
Again, it's another pair of glasses. It's another lens.
It all comes back to the glasses.
It's all about how we see. Exactly.
That is so true. So kind of going along with this, it's pretty interesting because the name of your company, Wild Rose Education. You chose Wild Rose. Why?
Well, a couple of reasons. So I wanted to have a name of a company that wasn't place specific, because you never know when you might move. And so it's very easy around here especially to think about naming things after the rivers or the mountains or the plants or something. And I was like, okay, I got to pick something that's not place specific. So wild roses live at least all over North America. They might live all over the world. I don't know. There's definitely the rose family is probably everywhere. But so that was one big piece of it. The other piece of it is that I have a passion and have had opportunities to teach about wild places and wild public lands and wilderness. So the word wild kind of symbolizes that. And my name is Sarah Rose. And so I like that name Rose. And so that's why I turned the company name to Wild Rose Education. And in the logo, you notice that there's a semblance of water in it. So that's blue, and there's a bit of a wave of a river or some type of body of water in
Right.
the logo. So that was
Right.
a fun project to try to put all that together and try to convince to tell the graphic designer I wanted a wild rose. And they're like, and they start drawing all these domestic roses from the flower shops. And I'm like, no, like 5-petaled wild rose.
Right. I'm going to quickly
But it was
say
all about so it's very, very intentional.
that is, I love that logo. I love that. It's so cool.
Yeah.
Because it's true. It's like, it's not one specific thing. Well, it is, but it's not. Like, it could be all different species. And like you said, it's found all over the place. So it has that inclusivity, and that could have all these stories behind it, which is so symbolic of what you're doing, what we were just talking about.
Thank you. Yeah. And if I ever decide to move somewhere else, I can just take it with me. I don't have to start over.
Right. Right.
And it's relatable.
So, random question, because I was listening to one of the other podcasts that you were talking about, where you were talking about Leopold.
Yeah, he's one of my favorites.
Okay, so can you tell people a little bit about that and what it is, and like who Aldo Leopold is or was?
Yeah. So one of my big heroes, one of my favorite conservation and wildlife biology heroes is Aldo Leopold. And Aldo Leopold lived in the early 1900s, and he died in the 1950s, I think. And he was a family man. He had a family family was really important to him. He was a university faculty, and he was a biologist, and he had an unbelievable relationship with the landscape. And he was an author, and his book that made him famous is called the Sand County Almanac, and it was not actually published until after he passed away. And so his work has been like this pivotal, that work of literature has become a go-to piece of literature that has been translated into hundreds of other languages, and is the kind of this understanding, it articulates an understanding of what a land ethic is, and what is an ethic, and what does it mean to have a land ethic. And a lot of that has to do with how you steward the land. It's not all about protecting it with capital W designated wilderness. It's more about what your relationship with the landscape is, and how you steward it, and how you take care of it, but also let it be wild.
Right.
And so my relationship with all of this is that, like I said, I was born into this kind of work. My parents are very much in the same vein of work and philosophy and life as I am. And my dad, I think, tries to emulate Aldo Leopold, and has ever since he was probably in his early 20s, or whenever he started to have an opportunity probably in high school is when my dad really started to have a relationship with a place, because that's when he moved from being a military brat, moving all over the world. They finally landed on a tract of land with a big forest. And so he was able to have that relationship with the landscape in a place that was special. So then my dad, I think he instilled that relationship with the landscape in all three of us kids. And for me, that looked like, I have vivid memories of being I don't know, 3 or 4 or 5-year-old, helping my dad plant trees. Like, we would go plant acorns. We'd go on peppermint walks, meaning we would eat peppermint sticks, and then we would have our pockets full of acorns, and we would literally go plant acorns to try to get more oak trees to grow in these places where there weren't many trees. And in Missouri in the fall or spring, it's muddy and wet and messy and out in the country. And I have vivid memories of that. And then as I got older, I got to be part of the process of burning fields, because we have, and Aldo Leopold, these are the kinds of things Aldo Leopold would do with his kids and his family. And we would burn the fields to try to keep the ecological prairie environment going. You burn, fire is used as a tool. It's not always a scary thing. Actually, most of the time fire is not scary. It's a tool for ecology in a lot of ways. And I was part of that my whole life, or my whole time at home until I moved away. And just everything, just because you happen to be fortunate enough to be a landowner doesn't mean that you just are like dominate the landscape. To be a landowner comes with a responsibility to be a steward, and because that landscape is connected to everything else. And I think learning that kind of unknowingly as a little tiny kid, um, and then understanding that more and more as I got older, and now continuing to be so grateful for that understanding, I think underlies a lot of where and why I do what I do. Because when you look at the land ethic, the Leopold idea of a land ethic, I can't quote it perfectly, but it's the idea that everything's interconnected, and everything, you have a responsibility to
Maintain your
to
section.
maintain that. And yet an ethic is something that, there's all kinds of philosophical conversations you can have about ethics. I mean, I facilitated many of those conversations, and what's my ethic versus yours doesn't mean that mine's right. It just means
Right.
that that's what I believe based on all this evidence and experience and so forth. So anyway, so we actually had a dog named Al at one point in my life, because he was named after Aldo Leopold. We also had a dog named Abby at one point, who was named after Edward Abbey. And I could go on and on. And I just gave a copy of the San County Almanac last week to a high school kid who was telling me all about his passion and interest in wildlife and how it's all connected and all this. I said, he's like 17 years old. And I said, I have a book. I'd like you to read this book this summer. And I collect used copies of it whenever I see him at the library book sales or whatever. And so that I can just give them away, and I don't ever need it back, but maybe he'll open it up and he'll be inspired. I don't know.
Right. Well, that's the most you can do, actually, is just give people basically give them the tools that you can give them, and then give them the boost.
Yeah.
And then what they do with that is,
Yeah.
it's up to them.
So that was a long-winded answer, but
no, it's all good. It's all good. There's a lot of stuff out there. I mean, it's environmental stuff is not one small little thing. I always find it fascinating. People are like, oh, well, you just care about environmental
the
issues.
environment
No,
is where you live. So
yeah,
guess what? Everybody has a relationship to the environment, because the environment is where you live. It's not something separate. It's
right.
not like you can say, well, we're working on environmental things now. Well, everything is an environmental thing, whether
Right. And it's socioeconomic. There's so many factors that go into with regards to how like things like climate change, how they disproportionately affect lower income and poorer countries, and how it all over the world, not just like people think, oh, it's just in Africa or it's just in Asia. No, it's everywhere. Like, it's not like the wind just stops at a boundary and says, okay, I'm moving on this way because I can't go over that. It's like what happens there is the whole butterfly effect. It's like what happens there carries over. It's all interconnected. We're in an enclosed ecosystem that just happens to be a very big planet that, what we do, what is it? Is it Chief Seattle that said it? Like, what we do to that web affects all of us, the web of life. And it's so true. It's like when people want to parse it out and say, well, that's not it. I can't make that priority. I'm like, you kind of have to, because if you don't have an environment, none of this other stuff matters. You can't breathe, you can't drink, like you can't eat.
it all comes down to like public health.
Right. And it spans all these things, like the socioeconomic side of things, and how it's a much bigger picture than I think a lot of people have given it credit for, or even made those connections. And
Yeah, I'd like to comment on that a little bit and just say that, I think the environmental movement, and I'm not the only one who thinks this, there's been many people have written papers and commented on this, is that environmental work looks like a very elitist work. And the people who do environmental work have traditionally been elite people, with wealthy people, white people, people with a lot of privilege. And unfortunately, those are the stories that have been told, and those are the stories that have been retold, and that's what gets celebrated. But when you start to dig a little deeper, there's a lot of amazing women of color, especially women, women, moms who are kicking butt and have for hundreds of years, making a difference in their community on all kinds of environmental issues that affect the health of their children, the health of their communities, the health of their landscapes, their parks, their whatever environmental thing it may be. And I think, and not just that, but there's people of the LGBTQ community, there's people of every community that have made a significant difference. And until the environmental community, whatever that even means these days, I'm starting to wonder if we need to redefine what that means. Until the general consensus, the most told story includes all these poor people. I mean, they're the poor people. They're the people who've been bullied. They're the poor people financially. Until their stories are elevated and celebrated, right, and they're seen as equals and valued, and I mean, our world wouldn't be the same without them because they're that important. and yet we haven't, you know, their books haven't been translated to hundreds of languages. And right, you know, I just told a whole story about Aldo Leopold. He's one of these, you know, old dead white men. Right. There's a lot of those stories. And I think it's a both and. I don't think it's that we have to erase. We don't need to erase any stories. We need to make the storyboard just a little bigger, or maybe a lot bigger, so that the Aldo Leopolds and the John Muirs and those folks are still on the board, but they're not the biggest and in the center. They're on the sidelines, or they're just like, you know, part of it. But so are the George Washington Carvers and the, I mean, and the, I don't even know the names, and that's terrible. We should know the names of who are these unsung heroes who have made significant difference in the inner cities of Detroit, making sure that their apartment buildings have clean water. Right. Those women and men are heroes. Right?
Yeah. And they're not the ones we hear about.
And I don't know their stories. I've started to dig into a few more stories than I've known before. Right. But it's like this never-ending project because there's so many, and they're incredible and they're important. So I think we have to think about what does the environmental field look like? And maybe how do we need to redefine how we describe it? Because until we redefine it, it's always going to be that thing that it has been, and it doesn't create the possibility for what it can become, or maybe has been is more accurately describes what it has become.
It's like in many ways, the environmental movement it's the human condition movement. It's the environmental field. Obviously it's all the species because it's the environment. I mean, we have to include all of them, but so much of humanity and the human condition is tied into our environment, whether it's the trees in our backyard or our literal environment, our ecosystem within our cities or our towns. Everything is interconnected, and all these stories, like you said, all these stories matter, and they're the fabric of which human society is built. And without listening or hearing or even making space for, we're never going to be able to move forward. We're just going to keep going in this little bubble, as we go along. And that's not solving any problems. One of the issues we ran into in South Africa that was starting to change, thankfully, was they kept looking at a lot of the conservation was sort of a school of thought where conservation was just in the reserve. What's going on within the reserve? And I was like, those reserves are surrounded by local communities of people who have never stepped foot in a reserve and never seen all of this wildlife because they don't have a few $100s to go in. It's like Disney World to them. It's, and it's like, that's their backyard, but they're excluded from it because they don't have the finances. And the ones that are involved are typically the ones that work within the reserves, but their stories are not necessarily included when they talk about the conservation plans of those places. And it's like, until we start looking at all of these interconnected elements of it, which all factor in, and these stories and all these different people that are involved, we're doing a disservice, I think, in whatever steps we're taking.
Yes, and I would add that just think about, actually, I thought I had just went whoop. Another. Leaders. So I thought about this is that not only do we need to include the stories, but we need to include the leaders, not just have the stories be told and celebrate the stories, but actually invite these people to be at the table. I've been finding myself thinking a lot about that song in Hamilton about being in the room, or it's not how the words go, but be lucky enough to be in the room where it happened. That's what it's called. And who gets to be in the room where it happens? And is that table have two sides, or is it a round table?
Right.
And who has the microphone? Is there only one microphone? And if so, that's okay, but who's holding it? And are we, not just including people at the table, but we're electing them to be part of boards, and we're selecting them to serve in leadership. And we're saying that no matter who you are, you get to be you're part of this community, and this board and decision-making body reflects the community. Right. And so I just think about, my table, I try really hard to make it really round and it's not a two-sided table, because that's really boring, and it's not really how the world works. And
that's like,
so all of this is it's also interconnected. And I think that the way we've been taught to live, whether in any academic, or not even academics, in any realm of professional field or wherever, is that we're very siloed. It's like, well, tell us about what you do for a living. Well, right. I'm an engineer. Right. I'm a banker. I'm a teacher. It's never, there's not always a lot of space for this like broader, messy explanation. And I think if we were to see the world as environmental issues are not environmental issues. They're not like this separate thing that it's now 2:00 and now it's time we work on environmental issues. No. It's like, I'm an architect. I build buildings, and I see the world through the lens of understanding climate change and understanding poor people. So I'm going to build buildings in that perspective. Or I'm a finance guy or gal, and I'm going to consider climate change and poor people as I design my financial lending business.
Make sure you
whatever it is. But it's not something that's like, don't just put that on the shelf and pull it off when it's convenient to work on it.
Right.
It's like, we have to do this work. It's this lens. Again, it's a lens for, whether it's whatever, it's a lens for how we have to do everything.
Right. This is interesting. This is what I was thinking of. And it so goes to what you were just saying. In a way, I mean, instead of ego being like us being at the top, but that also being like white male European at the top. It's like, if that were the table, it's like, we have to think of it from the perspective of it's all interconnected.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And all of us, all of our stories, and all of the stuff within this planet besides us.
And it's messy.
It's so messy. It's so messy.
And it's hard. It's messy, hard work. And it's, again, giving ourselves permission to be raggedy, and giving ourselves permission to assume the best intent of other people, and be comfortable enough in our own skin to be wrong, and be able to be like, oh, you're right, I should do it. Now I have another perspective, and now I can move forward with that newer idea that's maybe more accurate. Right. And be ready to know that what's true today is probably not going to be true tomorrow. It might not be, and that's okay. There's no judgment with that. Right. But that's pretty radical. Most people aren't able to work in that space because of so many different things they have so many pressures and so many external, whether they're perceived or actual pressures. They feel that they're there, and they're their reality, and that's valid too. Right. So there's it seems pretty idealistic to do what I'm saying, and I get that. And at the same time, I think it's something that we need to be striving for, to be able to tear down those barriers and work with people at these such basic levels to help them remember that their perspective matters, and that they matter, and that all these things that hold them back from being their true selves is actually holding back the entire community from thriving in its true self as a bigger community. And I mean, that's powerful stuff. And it's it's generations of work.
Oh yeah. No, this is not going to happen tomorrow. And it's like, and I think that's maybe what is keeping people from even doing it is there's that, I know like chatting with people about, well, how could I help? I'm just one person. It's like everything starts with the first step. It's like
Yeah.
you get yourself to go running in the morning, you put on a pair of shoes and walk out the door. Like that's the
Yeah.
first step. You don't even have to
Yes.
run a step, but you still have to put on the shoes and get out the door to be able to do it in the first place. It's like, it's just getting you on that road, and you've just got to get yourself on that road by taking that first step. And it might be a baby step, and it probably will be, but without taking that, no one's ever going anywhere. Like it's just never going to change. And so it's empowering, which is what it really so much of what you're doing. It's empowering people, empowering teenagers, empowering adults, and the whole community to say, we can do this. I can do this. I have something to contribute, and I have a role, and I have I'm important. Like my voice matters, and everybody's does. And that's the thing is like we keep getting, like you're saying, certain people are being told that their voice matters more than others, and that's not a fair representation because it's not a representation. It's completely skipping so much.
Yeah. And when that has been ingrained in your DNA for generations, it takes, it's not so easy to just say, talking to an individual to say, I want to know what you think. I care about you. I really do. What you think really does matter. That can be a very long, challenging conversation because they've, it's in their, DNA to not believe that because
Right.
they're culturally, they've been held back for generations.
Right.
And to try to change that will take a generation at least, I would imagine. But every one of us can begin to build that change just by getting to know your neighbors and realizing that just because they're different than you doesn't mean that they're anything less. They might actually make your life more fulfilling.
Right.
But giving them the time of day, even though they may be of a different socioeconomic world than you are, they may be of a different culture, but get to know them and invite them to your table. Whether
Right.
your table is out in the yard and you're sitting 6 feet apart, or you're,
Or it's a Zoom call.
yeah, whatever. But I mean, literally, we've been having Wednesday night front yard dinner the last few months with 6 feet apart. But the point in the front yard, we're sitting in the front yard because we want to see the people who walk down the street,
Right.
to be able to say hi and not be so isolated. And that's extremely intentional to be we carry the deck table around the house to the front yard and put it in the front yard, and there's about 6 of us that have dinner together, and that's important.
I think that's what's so fascinating about social media is that it's called social media and it's meant to be quote unquote interacting with people, but it's actually made us more isolated and lonely. As all these studies keep showing, it's like we're connected because we can't unplug, but in terms of the actual connection like that one-on-one where you get to spend time and you just even get to see someone's face while they're talking to you and their body language and how do they talk and what things really are. It's so different when you can't hide behind a computer and you just are you. And yeah, it's so necessary too. Like you said, it's like there's no moving forward without like even opening your front door. So awesome.
Yeah.
Man, Sarah, thank you so much. So
Yeah, thank you.
here's my question for you, and I guess you pretty much kind of answered it, but if you were to tell anyone, with a kid and adults, whatever, what is one thing that they could do today? One, my tiny thing, big thing, whatever, one thing that they can do today, like if they can start doing that, they think will make a more positive impact, where they can use sort of their voice to make a positive impact on the world around them.
I think that at a most basic level is they need to take the opportunity to see what's right in front of them, take off their headphones, their earbuds, and be quiet and be in the backyard, be in the front yard, be on the sidewalk, wherever they may be, and notice what's in front of them. And whether that's other people or that's a tree or that's a crack in the sidewalk, to start to just notice what's there and take note of it, and then be able to start to talk about that with somebody and share that with somebody and communicate that with somebody, and then start to ask more questions about it. and to engage in that conversation with whether with a little brother or sister or an aunt or uncle or whoever is in their lives, their parents, but just turn off the noise and start to notice what's around you. Because I think the curiosity is that part of our DNA, that's part of how we're wired. It will come back. You can bring it back, even though it's been suppressed or taught out of you by about fourth grade. That curiosity and that sense of wonder, and whether you're a 10-year-old or a 50-year-old, I have the same advice. And be ready to be astonished by what you see and hear and notice.
That's awesome. I love it. Oh my gosh. Thank you so much, Sarah. I really appreciate it.
Go read some Mary Oliver poetry.
I know, right? Oh, she's one of my absolute all-time favorites.
That's where the astonished part comes from.
Yeah. Right. She like manages to capture it all in 10 words, what like my whole brain is trying to formulate for hours.
Well, thank you so much for being so interested. And it's always a pleasure and a gift to be able to share what I think about, because I don't always get to talk about, I don't think any of us really get a chance sometimes to really talk about what we're really passionate about and kind of how we perceive the world. And I mean, I write about it in a journal or I talk about it here and there, but I just really appreciate the opportunity. It means a lot.
Well, like you said, it's a round table. It's got to be a round table and everybody's voice matters. And
well,
I really
thanks for taking the time.
Well, no, I thank you. I appreciate that you're taking the time and what you're doing. I appreciate what you're doing and your mission with everything. And I think it's fantastic. So Sarah Johnson, it's wildroseeducation.com. Awesome. Well, Sarah.
Thank you, Genevieve, and have a wonderful rest of the summer.
You too. Take care. You've been listening to Nature Knows, Conversations with Wild Warriors and Changemakers. I'm your host, Jen Vitanzo. And if you want to find out more about today's guest, Sarah Johnson, you can head on over to wildroseeducation.com. It's wildroseeducation.com. I'll be sure to add a link in the podcast description. If you want to keep up to date on what's going on with the series, visit lateshiftmedia.com, where you can find additional information about the guests, the work they're doing, and any cool links they recommend you check out. Late Shift Media is also where you can go to find out about upcoming episodes and future guests, and where you can sign up to stay up to date with the series. Again, it's lateshiftmedia.com. Thanks so much for tuning in, and I hope you have an amazing day.